I'm here with Dr. Cornelius Hunter, a biophysicist, and we love talking about all the problems with evolution. And it's like a bottomless pit of problems. Well, we're doing this series talking about how the strong arguments for evolution are religious in nature. And we have a really exciting argument today. It's the argument from small scale evolution. And on the face of it, this does not seem like a religious argument at all. So I'm really excited to hear what Dr. Hunter is going to present for us today. Welcome, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Rebecca, and look forward to it. So yes, if we could turn on the slides. We are in a 6-part series. This is part 3, or the third installment of a 3-part series. And Rebecca said, we love looking at the problems, but also I love looking at the strengths, at the powerful arguments for evolution. So the first 2 installments of this 6-part series were nested hierarchy and homology, 2 of the textbook, very powerful slam dunk arguments for evolution, proving it to be a fact, at least if you agree with the premises. Now, in those 2, both of those 2 categories of arguments for evolution, there is a 3-step process that we saw in both of those 2 podcasts: the claim, the failure, and the persistence. Now, in other words, there's this powerful claim, evidential claim made by evolutionists, and it fails spectacularly. At least it seems to fail. But in fact, if you really understand it, it doesn't fail. It is actually very powerful evidence for evolution if you agree with the premises. So that's the difference here. So there's this subtlety that you need to understand if you're going to understand evolution. So there's the claim, there's the failure. It persists because in the evolutionary view, it hasn't failed. There's just these little details. It's a subtle thing, but we absolutely need to understand that. So that's going to show up again today in this small scale change evidence for evolution. These 3 steps. So watch for these 3 steps. I'll lay them out very clearly. So small scale evolution, the powerful evidence for evolution. This is a major category that shows up in the textbooks, in the apologetics for evolution. Small scale evolution. Now, what's the idea here? The idea here is most of the evidence for evolution is inferential. So the fossil record, the comparative anatomy, the embryology, the biogeography, you got all this evidence here, but you're having to kind of make inferences. You're not, you don't actually see evolution happening. So it's seen as very powerful, slam dunk proofs of evolution, but you don't actually see anything. So you bring in small scale evolution. What that means is evolutionary change occurring within a lifetime, within our lifetimes, within a Ph.D. thesis time frame, within the time frame of a study. So, and on the order of a months or years or a few years, you can see this evolutionary change happening. Of course, it's not creating huge changes, but that's at least patching this gap in the evolutionary evidence, that you've got these cases of actual observable evolutionary change happening. Evolution in action, as Julian Huxley said.
Yeah, can I ask a question before you move on? Because you're calling it small scale evolution. Is what you're calling small scale evolution equivalent to microevolution, or is there a slight difference?
Yeah, there was a slight difference. And yes, you're right. Microevolution is kind of the traditional term of art. It usually refers to change within a species, and then change outside of it, going beyond the species level, is called macroevolution. The problem there is, first of all, there's different definitions of species, so it's a little bit hard to track that. Secondly, it really isn't that big of a deal. Like, there isn't like this magic boundary where, we have change going beyond the species level, therefore evolution is true, or therefore evolution can just run wild. It's not that important of a distinction. So small scale change or small scale evolution simply refers to a lot less change going on, usually within a species, but it might create a new species. But it's still subject to the kind of problems and assumptions that we're looking at in this video. So yeah, it's bigger than microevolution, but it's in the same ballpark. And there's a whole bunch of examples of this. I won't go through all of these examples in detail in this video. If you're an evolutionist or you follow the literature, you've heard of these things. There's the breeders. In Darwin's day, there were breeders. Breeding has always been important, and breeders can make all kinds of changes. If you're breeding chickens, you can breed chickens to produce more eggs, or you can breed them to produce more meat, or you can produce them to be better with cold temperatures, or better with hot temperatures, or more resistant to disease, et cetera. It's better with foraging, et cetera, better against predators, all kinds of things you can breed for. So yeah, we've been doing evolution in a sense for centuries and centuries. So that right there is showing you that there's this kind of, Darwin talked about this in his book, there's this kind of, evolution has been going on. Of course, it's not the same thing. But then in the wild, you also have all kinds of changes. This classic case of the British peppered moth changing colors in response to environmental shifts, industrial pollution in that case. We've all heard of bacteria gaining resistance to antibiotics, insects gaining resistance to pesticides that farmers use. There's also this thing called ring species. There's a long-term evolution experiment that's been run by Richard Lenski at Michigan State University. The stickleback fish is a great example of this really significant morphological change occurring in this species. Big changes in this little fish. Birds and tortoises that Darwin studied in his trip around the world, his 5-year voyage around the world, finches and mockingbirds and tortoises, suggest it's a little more subtle. However, later follow-on work by the Grants showed they studied the finches on the Galapagos Islands, and they did what Darwin couldn't do, is actually track the morphological changes, the evolutionary changes in these finches over many years, and showed that, yeah, they are evolving like right before our eyes. We can track this within a lifetime, these evolutionary changes in finches. There's also all kinds of other examples in the wild: guppies, mussels, lizards, et cetera, of species that when we track them, they undergo non-trivial changes that are very interesting to study. And it's interesting to look at the causes of these. So all kinds of examples of small scale change that evolutionists point to as a major pillar of evidence, combining it with all the inferential evidence for their theories, making the argument, pretty powerful. How can you be a creationist farmer? Says Jonathan Weiner. He's a science writer. He's written about the finches. His point is, if you're going to be a farmer and you're using pesticides and you're trying to fight off the insects, you have to understand these things. You can't be a creationist. So that's the kind of idea here. Here is a paper on those British peppered moths that I talked about. And there's been some back and forth on this. There's been some mistakes made, but in more recent years, they've kind of wrung it out and gotten cleaned up their act and shown that, yeah, this is another example of small scale change clearly happening that we can track. It's not just a few years; it's more like a century, but within a short enough time that we have records and we can track this. And they say in this paper here, industrial melanism. So it's the moths changing color. So melanism caused by industrial pollution in the peppered moth is still one of the clearest and most easily understood examples of Darwinian evolution in action. Darwinism in action, evolution in action. That's you often hear that phrase. So that's kind of the argument in a nutshell. Obviously, there's more to be said, but that gets you the idea. It turns out there's a lot of major problems with that evidence. This is from a theory neutral point of view. You don't have to be a creationist or an intelligent design guy or anything like that. There are major scientific empirical failures, strong failures with everything I just said. So contraindications. I'm going to boil it down to 3 categories of contraindications. One is those observed changes that I've just talked about. Well, in most cases, in many of them, they're just limited. They just don't go very far. Seems like there's a boundary around them. And in fact, they often will revert back to where they were when the pressure is released. The pressure is no longer applied. The breeders were a good example of this. Breeders for centuries have known, yeah, I can do things with these species, like the chickens I just talked about, there's only so far I can go. And Darwin, really got up to speed on that and realized this is kind of a problem for my theory, because the fact is there are known limits. This is kind of a known thing in the breeding technology. The German polymath Goethe had his law of compensation. And the idea was, when you breed a population for something, you're going to lose something else. So there's only so much you can do. Nature will compensate for what you're doing. So I mentioned on the chickens, you can breed for all these different things. You can't breed for all of them. And if you get one thing, you're going to lose something else. So it seems like there's this law of compensation. Now, there's been several other people after that, more recent, that have talked about this sort of thing. I.M. Lerner was a geneticist in the mid-20th century. He had this. He formulated this concept of genetic homeostasis, that the genome resists change, and it tends to try and stay where it is. Homeostasis. So it's not exactly a good sign for evolution. The Grant's finches, I talked about these finches that were studied on the Galapagos Islands by the Grants, and it turns out, it was a change in the shape and size of the beak, and it was in response to drought conditions, climatological changes. And then it went back to the old shape when the climate returned. So
I've heard that about the finches. I mean, about the peppered moths too, is that when pollution levels went up, you'd have the color changing to match that. When the Clean Air Act happened, then you saw them go back to the original coloring, or so there's like fluctuation based on what's happening environmentally, but there's not a changing and moving on.
Exactly. You don't get that extrapolation. In fact, you read my mind, because I'm going to talk about that in a few slides. Go back to the British moth example in a slide or two. But the breeders, Goethe's law of compensation. Here's that peppered moth paper. They said, remember what they said? I showed this a few slides ago. It was Darwinian evolution in action. No, this is exactly what Rebecca just said. So here's a chart. Time is on the horizontal axis here, going from the 1800s up to 1900s to 2000, showing how the dark phenotype went from essentially zero on up to dominating the population. And then, as you said, when the pollution went away, back down to a very small component of the population. So, what happened in this population? Were there any new genes? Well, no new genes were evolved. Were there new metabolic pathways? No new metabolic pathways, no new organs, no new limbs, no new wings, no new body plans. You get the point. It was just a dark colored moth, which pre-existed the industrial pollution problem. So the dark colored component of the population began to dominate, because the white colored component was easily killed by the birds, eaten up by the birds. So, you could argue evolution, created this dark phenotype. Even that would have been a low probability insertion of a transposable element at just the right place, and kind of an unusual transposable element. That's a whole nother story. So this is not at all suggesting or demonstrating or even suggesting some sort of something that could extrapolate to some new species or new genes or new metabolic pathways and so forth. It just isn't working like that. So I put a no sign, a not sign on that. Okay, number two, this problem can be looked at a little bit more analytically and quantitatively, and researchers have done that and looked at, what is these small scale mechanisms, the mechanisms that cause small scale change, like mutations, like transposable element insertions, like recombination, changing of gene allele frequencies, and all this sort of thing. What can these do? How far can you get with these? And the answer is not very far. One researcher, Douglas Irwin, has looked at this and done some really good work on this, as well as many other researchers. He's got this paper, look at the title here, Macroevolution is more than repeated rounds of microevolution. So those are the terms we were talking about a minute ago. The point here is, no, it doesn't extrapolate. The small scale mechanisms, small scale change mechanisms do not extrapolate to large scale change. You have to have something else. There must be something else at work to create novelty, to create new genes, to create new body plans, create new organs. That is not accounted for by the sorts of mechanisms that give us small scale change. There is a disconnect. This is not a continuum. Large scale patterns, he says, reveal a richness to evolution unexplained by microevolution. Of course, he casts this into an evolution paradigm. He's an evolutionist, but he's admitting that, yeah, the microevolution, the small scale change mechanisms don't work. So small scale change can be used as evidence for evolution only to the extent that it can extrapolate, or they can extrapolate, to large scale change. The small scale change or the small scale mechanisms, small scale change mechanisms must somehow support the large scale change. Otherwise, this is not a valid evidential claim. And well, it doesn't. Small scale change doesn't extrapolate. Michael Behe has also done a lot of really good work on this. He's been, some of his work focuses on random mutations and natural selection, kind of the bread and butter of evolutionary theory, right? We're supposed to have, all of these species arising from random mutations and natural selection. He's looked at a lot of different examples. One was the problem of protein-protein interaction. When proteins interact in the quaternary structure, there's a lot of amino acids that have to interact with each other. The geometry and the chemistry have to be just right. It's not a trivial, interface. You have to have a lot of amino acids in that primary structure just right. And the tertiary structure has to fit. This is not a trivial problem, and it's beyond the capability. You can't constructing those interfaces is beyond the capability of random mutation and natural selection. That's one example. He looks at several other examples. So random mutation and natural selection can only do a little bit. Just a few. If you need more than 3 or 4 mutations to enact a change, you're getting beyond the edge of the capabilities of evolution. So these guys are doing quantitative analysis to look exactly what is possible, looking at these known mechanisms that create small scale change. Here is another paper that came out about the same time. In contrast to trait loss, the gain of genetically complex traits appears to be harder in that it requires the deployment of multiple gene products in a coordinated spatial and temporal manner. Obviously, this is unlikely to happen in a single step because it requires potentially numerous changes at multiple loci. This is basically the kind of problem that Behe was looking at, being admitted to by these evolutionists in this paper. So the point here is the claim that small scale change mechanisms are a great pillar of evidence for evolution just doesn't hold. Small scale adaptation does not explain large scale change required by evolution. It's a major problem. So, by the way, this also demonstrates that evolutionists lack a cause. There's no known plausible, slam dunk cause in evolutionary theory for how you create the tens of millions of species and the hundreds of thousands or millions of genes and all gene families and all the incredible designs in all these different species. There's no known cause that you can how this could obviously be created by evolution, the mechanisms of evolution. So it's a pretty big problem. When you have a theory, you'd like to have a cause, right? Okay, the third of my 3 contraindications. Small scale change often is too fast. And the problem often is directed adaptation. In other words, the change that we see happening, like the lizards I talked about, and the mussels and the guppies, and so many of these changes, even the finches, they show that, yes, there was a change, but it wasn't by random mutation and natural selection. It was a rapid change occurring to the majority of the individuals in the population within a generation or two. So in other words, you brought on an environmental shift, some sort of environmental challenge, and what? All of a sudden, the species adapted in response to the challenge. It wasn't I got lucky with a random mutation and then it slowly propagated through the population. That's what the evolution model calls for. No, it was directed. It was a directed adaptation. And evolution.
Would the stickleback fish be an example of that?
Yes, stickleback is another one. Yep.
With the lizards, I know one of the things that happened is they evolved a cecal valve when they were placed on an island with a different diet with vegetation instead of meat eating. They grew a valve that helped them digest the plants. And I mean, you can still go online right now and find Richard Dawkins videos talking about what a great example of evolution this is, and articles that haven't been retracted. But actually, the researchers were like, okay, what happens if we put them back on a meat diet? And they lost the cecal valve. So same animal, this is all happening very quickly. So all that showed is that they already had the capability to make that cecal valve when it was needed. Right.
And I would go a lot further than, instead of saying all that shows, I would say this is a remarkable finding of the incredible adaptation capabilities that organisms have. They are able to respond to unforeseen future environmental changes, whether it's the diet or the climate or the predators, what have you. And they can enact these changes rapidly in response to the change. That is an incredible capability that organisms, species have built into them. It doesn't work with evolution. In fact, not only does it not work with evolution, evolutionists vigorously and scathingly criticized that idea throughout the 20th century. That was the third rail of evolutionary theory. If you talked about that sort of thing, directed adaptation, you put your career at risk. In fact, even now, today, it's still controversial. A lot of evolutionists still oppose this or claim that it's really nothing. And I'll talk about that in a slide or two here. So yeah, it doesn't work with evolution in a big way. In fact, this is my slide here. So a lot of this directed adaptation falls under the category of epigenetics. Not all of it. There's also a lot of other mechanisms that we don't call epigenetics. But epigenetics is a major category where you can control the gene expression. Basically, you're deciding which genes to express, which ones to turn on and turn off. And that's an important part of running the show, running an organism, and even changing its morphology. And so epigenetics is a very powerful genetic regulation, category of genetic regulation. And it smacks of teleology because it is responding rapidly to what's needed instead of randomly mutating, and then the lucky mutation gets selected for it. That's the evolution model. This is the body responds intelligently. It already has this built-in capability that is opposed vigorously by evolutionists until they no longer could. And now they're kind of stuck with, well, what are we going to do about this since we can no longer? I know when I had a debate with Richard Harrison at Cornell University in 2006-ish, and he was the head of the biology department. And this was one of my arguments, was epigenetics. This was 20 years ago when it was still largely opposed by evolutionists. And he just, waved it off, said, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. This is not important. And he put his name, his stamp of authority in front of all the young undergrad students there of like, no, this guy's doesn't know what he's talking about. It's unfortunate. So that's where evolution has led us, to this denial of the science. So what are my bullets here? Epigenetics is an example of directed adaptation. It is an immediate response to environmental threats. It's too complicated to evolve by random mutations. It's just phenomenally complicated. There's all these actors, all these proteins that have to do their thing. It would not be selected for if you somehow got lucky and somehow astronomical odds against evolved an epigenetic mechanism. It wouldn't be selected for because it doesn't address a current need. That's what evolution is all about. It has to be a current need. Mutations have to meet a current need. They have to improve fitness now, not an era into the future, not millions or hundreds of thousands of years in the future, or thousands or hundreds or tens of years in the future. It's got to be now. And it doesn't do that. They don't do that. So if you got so you got two major problems. It's way too complicated to evolve these mechanisms. And if you somehow did, they wouldn't be selected for. So this doesn't work under evolutionary theory. Now, as I said, evolutionists have opposed this throughout the 20th century, scathingly. You would never say that you're interested or researching this sort of thing in the 20th century. And they said it can't cause evolution. It can't cause a large scale change. So first they denied epigenetics. And then they said, well, yes, we're now getting enough evidence. Yes, there's this thing. It's a thing. There is such a thing as epigenetics, but it's not transgenerational. So you can, within a lifetime, an organism can manipulate its genes in response to threats. That was a big step for evolutionists to take, but it's not transgenerational. Okay, it's only within a lifetime. Then they had to back up and let that one and agree that it's transgenerational. We do see it being passed on to the progeny, but it can't last very long. It's not robust. Maybe a couple of generations. It can last a lot of generations, but it can't create large-scale change. Okay, on that one, they're probably, that's a more robust position. It probably doesn't create create a new body plan, something like that. You think of it as a physiological change that is on a higher level, than just your typical physiological changes. But it's not going to, create, mammals where there were no mammals. So if it doesn't create large-scale change, then we just shot this evidence in the foot. We just shot ourselves in the foot. Remember, what's the claim here? Small-scale change is evidence for evolution. It's evidence for large-scale change. It can extrapolate. Oh, wait a minute. We're just saying it can't extrapolate. It doesn't extrapolate. So again, another failure point for this evidence. The whole small-scale evidence argument is falling apart. Yes?
Well, I wanted to clarify, are they saying it can't extrapolate for just the epigenetics, or are they saying it can't, what do you mean that they're saying we can't extrapolate?
I'm talking specifically in reference to epigenetic mechanisms. So these mechanisms that regulate gene expression. They turn on, they turn off gene expression in response to environmental shifts. That sort of change, yes, it can be transgenerational. It can be passed on, which is another amazing, by the way, incredibly amazing capability that I can create within my lifetime. Gene expression change that can regulate gene expression as needed via these mechanisms. But then it gets into the sex cells. It gets into the germ. My body has the complexity of epigenetics. It not only can do this, which is incredibly complex, but it can then inject that programming into the sex cells. And then when you have kids, it gets passed on to the kids. So that's remarkable in and of itself. But to your question, then they're saying that okay, these epigenetic mechanisms can alter gene expression and therefore, do a lot of changes. It can do a lot of things, like with the stickleback fish, morphological
Right.
that are significant. But it can't, create. It's not going to end up with large-scale evolutionary change, like creating mammals.
So then are you saying that we've found that most of the small changes are epigenetic changes, not mutation plus natural selection?
It's hard to put a fraction on it exactly what's what. I don't think we know enough to say most, but I would actually think so. I mean, I would say most is what we call small scale changes that are significant, that are meaningful, that are important, are some sort of directed adaptation. It might fall in the epigenetic category. It might fall into some other category, but it's directed. It is intelligently responding to environmental challenges or shifts. So, but there's probably all kinds of changes that don't fall in that category, but there are in other categories that are limited and are just going to revert when the threat goes away. It one way or another, it doesn't support the large-scale change required by evolution.
Right. And actually, I have an example of how there's still a resistance to this idea. So I recently talked to an evolutionary scientist, a professor, who was telling me how, we've observed that when animals, mammals move to Arctic or, cold regions, that they develop stocky traits. Like they develop like a stockier build and their limbs get shorter and things like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, isn't that interesting that we've observed that happening over and over again, like even among different species? And I said, to me, that seems like it must be something like an adaptation that is available to the organisms, like it's already there present, and that it's kind of a directed adaptation. And he was like, no, 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 no. It is mutation plus natural selection. And I'm like, wow, I mean, that would be really, serendipitous, right? To have over and over again, we observe the same thing where when organisms get in that environment or mammals get in that environment, they develop that same trait. So
exactly.
That shows the resistance. And, so I think I even asked, like, how do you know it's mutation plus natural selection? And I don't think he really had an answer for that. He just said, it's gotta be, it's gotta be.
Yeah.
So, but why does it have to be, right? Like,
it's theory-driven science. Theory-laden is what philosophers call it. Yeah, you are wedded to a theory, so you're going to interpret through that filter, and you're going to teach through that filter. And yeah, it's a great example, Rebecca. A great example. It happens over and over and over again. Gee, it seems like maybe that's inherent. Maybe that's a typical capability. No, it just was random every time. Even the same solution was found. So you require a high level of mutations to occur, because in all of these species, they're finding the same solution in this huge universe, this design space containing all kinds of bad designs and maybe a few good ones here and there. It has to be exploring this space like crazy. So you have to have this very high rate of mutation, which evolutionists don't quantify. If you quantified actually how many mutations, what's the mutation rate required to support that sort of capability to explore the space like that, you would find that it's an overload. The mutational load is too high, and evolution breaks down. If you have too many mutations, evolution can't work, because you just have disaster on your hands. The organisms are just constantly failing. So the mutation rate has to be bounded for evolution even to work. Well, if that's bounded, you can't explore the space like that. So that's another totally different category of problem for evolution, which arises. But yeah, I have a video on the British peppered moth, and I show that they resort to exactly what you said, Rebecca, serendipity, or one other thing that they resort to is teleology. So they'll just make teleological explanations. Well, they did it for this reason. And then you say, well, wait a minute, you can't do it for that reason. That's teleological. So, but you'll see that in the papers. It's either teleology or it's just this incredible serendipity. It just happened that way. Oh, evolution got lucky again.
And, we've talked about it a lot, but for those who might be tuning in for the first time, why can't they say that it was, the organism did it for, the rodent developed a stockier build to adapt to its environment? Why can't they say that according to evolution theory?
For the same reason that they can't accept epigenetics, or they couldn't accept epigenetics for a century, because that implies that the organism has a built-in intelligence, that it's directed, that it's responding like a little machine, or there's a little agent in there sensing the need and responding to the need. And they don't want, if you that smacks of teleology, and the entire project at the base, the fundamental requirement of Epicureanism, and Epicureanism version 2.0, which is evolution, is to get rid of teleology. And you might say, well, why is that? The reason you need to get rid of teleology is because you can't believe that God would have created this world. I've got this toothache. I've got this aching back. There's there's parts of the earth I don't like. There's predation. There's disease. All these people are sick and dying. There's these tsunamis that are killing people like crazy. There's the 1755 problem. So we can't accept or believe that God would have created this world. It's a theological concern that's been around forever. It's not just the problem of evil. It's other things about designs that we don't like. It's not always predation and disease. There's actually some of the most powerful arguments are more subtle than that. And it's just the patterns that don't make sense. Like if God reuses a design over and over again instead of optimizing, well, why would he do that? And these are very important. Like, it's easy to look at these arguments and to disparage them and say, these, dumb, they're not theologically informed, and, they don't understand classical theology and so forth. Yeah, that's true in a lot of cases, but these arguments do spring from deeply held, important theological problems. I don't agree with their solutions, and I think they're non-biblical and nonsensical, but I also recognize that they are deeply held and they are of concern to people. Like, is God capricious? Like, that's a serious question, because if he just put the trunk on the elephant, huge trunk, and that little tiny tail on the back just to be funny, it's like, look at this one, I'm going to make this ridiculous animal. It's this tail, this little tiny tail, and this huge thing, and this big, huge tail on the front. Is that just arbitrary and capricious? I mean, people are worried about that. And it's, you can kind of understand people being worried about that. This gets into whole deeper questions of, the theological issues at hand. But it's important to at least air that out a little bit, just to respect and to recognize the arguments on the other side, and to give them their fullest expression, and to see, first of all, not to deny them, because evolutionists deny these things and say, well, we don't make those arguments. Well, yes, of course you do. They're all through the literature. That's your theory depends on these arguments. It's contingent on these arguments. It entails and incorporates these arguments and assumptions, but they're not ridiculous. I disagree with them, but at least we really should at least understand them and where they're coming from, because they come from leading Christian in the modern age, at least, very popular and influential Christian theologians and philosophers. People like Gottfried Leibniz and others have expressed these things.
I feel like I broke your flow because you were still talking about the scientific problems, and then I sort of got you jumped into talking about the theology. So
that's okay. No, but it's okay. I mean, we can do that.
Okay. Because I feel like maybe, there's some people, if they haven't been exposed to this idea before about the religious arguments to evolution, they might be like, whoa, what just happened here? I thought
Right.
we were talking about the science and now
Right.
you're God this, God that. Where's all
It's
this
true.
God stuff? We're not
Yeah.
doing that. Evolution is science.
Right.
So
And
do
it
you want
is.
to finish
Yeah.
taking us through the
Yeah.
argument?
So let's respond to that right now, because we've looked at the claim and we've looked at the failure of the claim. So the claim was small scale change is that's a pillar of evidence for evolutionary theory. And now we've seen, well, that actually doesn't work. It doesn't work, and it's all for a variety of reasons. So the irony here, by the way, before we move further, the irony is adaptation resulting from highly complex mechanisms opposed by evolutionists like epigenetics is a pillar of evidence for evolution. So they're claiming as a pillar for evidence this fantastic adaptation capability, this incredibly complex, unevolvable adaptation, smart, directed adaptation capability as, oh, this is evidence for evolution. And you just see that a lot in evolutionary theory, this incorporating, this subsuming of incredible evidence as on the evolution side. Okay, so what's the so what here? Because none of this actually matters to evolutionists. The evolutionists don't miss a beat on all of this. In fact, a lot of what I just talked about is published by evolutionists. And evolutionists, are the first to admit and to talk about, oh yeah, we got this problem, we got that problem. And these are major problems. But they never will you find in the literature, oh, well, maybe we should retract this small scale evidential claim. Maybe we should not be using that anymore. No, it's still, right there in the textbooks and in the popular books. So that brings us to, remember when we started out, I said you have the claim, you have the failure, but you have the persistence, because the failure really wasn't a failure. Everything we just talked about, all these problems, are not actually a failure. And if you are arguing against evolutionists and you're pounding it home, you're driving home these scientific evidences and the scientific facts as, demolishing the evolutionist claims, then you're missing the point. And you will never address what they're actually saying, what evolutionists are claiming. You're talking past them. And they're like, well, so what? It's still a fact. Why is it a fact? So that brings us to what the argument actually really is. And you can get this if you read the literature carefully. A lot of evolutionists don't even understand this day, because the foundation has all been laid. So let's just talk briefly about Carl Linnaeus. We talked about him a couple of podcasts ago in the nested hierarchy one. We talked about how he developed this, classification method. His name is also associated strongly with a doctrine or a concept called the fixity of species. It's not just Carl Linnaeus, but it was strongly associated with him. He was, I've called him a super scientist. He's one of those incredibly popular, influential names. He was a century before Darwin, very, very important scientist. And he advocated this idea of a fixity of species, or immutability of species. What does that mean? They don't change. The species don't change. They are fixed. And why would he do that? I mean, you can kind of see the echoes of greater God theology here. What is greater God theology? The greater God would create the best world, the most optimal world. He wouldn't create a world that needs tweaking, that needs fixing, that needs adjusting. And that showed up in Leibniz's debate, 1715. So that's at the beginning of the 18th century. Now, Linnaeus was an 18th century guy. He came a little bit later. So this was, at the beginning, 1715, 1716, the Leibniz-Clarke debate with Isaac Newton kind of in the background behind Clarke. So one of the issues in that debate was the stability of the solar system. And is it really stable? And Leibniz at that time had run up against the specter of the kind of awkward conclusion that it's not stable. The solar system is not long-term stable. Now, that since has been addressed over time by Laplace and others. But at the time, it seemed like it wasn't stable. And Leibniz argued vigorously against that. And because Clarke's and Isaac Newton's solution was, well, God can adjust the planets whenever he feels like it, whenever the need arises. So when you do have a perturbation and instability is going to start to arise and start to propagate, God can just, with a divine finger, adjust the offending planet or planets and keep things stable. And that was an anathema to Leibniz. He didn't merely disagree. He went, the full 9 yards, that this is blasphemy. You're blaspheming God. God would never create a world that is later in the need of adjustment. Now, you can trace this back even earlier to Thomas Burnet, who wrote probably the most famous cosmogony in the 17th century. So a few years before Leibniz. Leibniz may have been influenced in this regard. He was aware of Burnet. So you can trace this idea of, God not creating something that needs tweaking, and the world must work on its own, to at least to Thomas Burnet. That's one of the kind of ideas of the greater God theology, this idea that the greater God would create the better world. And so you can kind of see how fixity of species would fit right in there with it. Now, I have not made that historical trace, but I'm suggesting at least that you see that there's at least a parallel there, that the fixity of species, if species change, then that would suggest they needed an adjustment, like the planetary positions needed an adjustment. So that's not a good sign. It's better, the species should be perfect, should be optimally adapted to the conditions in which we find them and all that sort of thing. So you can kind of see this fixity of species, where the theological grounding of it, but that we don't need to go further with that for now. The point is, there was this doctrine of fixity of species firmly in hand in the 18th century with Linnaeus and others. Now, Linnaeus was concerned about this later in life. He realized that it wasn't quite working. Like, for example, with hybrids, you can have two different species crossing and creating an offspring, and that's a hybrid. And so that starts to challenge this fixity of species idea. And so Linnaeus softened his view, but to no consequence. It was a very powerful concept. And when you get into the 19th century, into Darwin's day, that was a thing. Fixity of species was a thing. So that's what I say in these two slides. I'll skip through these two slides. It was still strongly in place in the 19th century. So by Darwin's time, the fixity of species was still consequential. It was still a very important thing. And okay, so you got this concept of fixity of species. And obviously, if that's true, then evolution is not going to work, right? Evolution, if they're just fixed. So for Darwin, this was important. Darwin went around the world on the HMS Beagle, 5 years. What a great adventure he had as a young man, saw and witnessed all kinds of things. They, among other things, they went to these island groups. And one of them was the Falkland Islands off of Argentina in the South Atlantic. Another was the Galapagos off of Ecuador in the Pacific. And those were great adventures and also great opportunities to experiment and to see what's the difference between the islands. Got these different islands here. What are the species like on one versus the other? And Darwin did find some differences. And well, it wasn't just Darwin. The locals could tell him, yeah, well, that one goes on that island. That tortoise is from that island, and that tortoise is from that island. They could recognize those differences. Darwin contemplated the possibility that they were different species, not just different varieties. And that he wrote in his notes on his specimen collections that he would pass on to people when he got back to England. He wrote, such facts would undermine what? The stability of species. So that was a thing for Darwin. That was important. It was consequential. This fixity of species doctrine or concept was very important. And could it be undermined? And so Ernst Mayr, one of the top evolutionists in the 20th century, a century later, did a fair amount of historical work, even though he was a scientist. And he looked at Darwin's development of his theory, and he wrote, Darwin called his great work On the Origin of Species, for he was fully conscious of the fact that the change from one species into another was the most fundamental problem for evolution. The fixed essentialistic species was the fortress to be stormed and destroyed. Once this had been accomplished, evolutionary thinking rushed through the breach like a flood through a break in the dike. Okay, that sounds interesting and reasonable, but we're not talking about large scale change. We're talking about small scale change. So what Meyer is saying there is what's key to evolution is proving small scale change actually happens. If I can prove that small scale change actually happens, like a new species being created or speciation, breaking the species barrier or something like that, then I proved evolution. Because why? The other alternative is fixity of species. Let me show you another leading evolutionist from about the same time, Doug Futumya from Stony Brook University, distinguished professor, Stony Brook University. He wrote this book, Science on Trial. I'm going to read you a couple of sentences where he lays this out in the same way. Creation and evolution, between them, exhaust the possible explanations. I put that in yellow because that is a huge premise. Exhaust the possible explanations for the origin of living things. In other words, he has created a set of all possible explanations. And how many are there? Two. There are two possible explanations. If you can do that in science, if you can structure the problem like that, where you have your theory and you have the alternate theory, and there are no other possibilities. So one is false, one is true. They can't both be true. They can't both be false. One is true, one is false. If I can falsify the other one, the alternate, then mine is true. That is a very, very powerful way. It's also practically impossible to do in science. You have to have metaphysical premises to do this, but it's very powerful to do that. So he's created this idea. Well, it's not just him. I like this passage from Futumya because it really does characterize and represent evolutionary thought. This is the way the evolution literature reads, and especially the apologetics, the arguments for why evolution is true. It always works this way. Oh, well, the other one is wrong, therefore we're right. Skipping down, organisms either appeared on the earth fully developed, or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed from pre-existing species by some process of modification. If they did appear in fully developed state, they must indeed have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. If species were created out of nothing in their present form, they will bear within them no evidence of a former history. That's important. No evidence. So if there's even the tiniest bit of evidence for a former history, okay, evolution is true. If they are the result of a historical development, any evidence of history is evidence of evolution. So again, he's got this very clean, nice structure to his problem. He's got evolution and he's got creationism, which he's explaining here is what? Purely static. And so we're kind of getting this from the greater God theology of the world cannot adapt. It cannot change. It cannot change at all. It's got to be purely static. It's like these, Platonic forms. Like everything's got to be just, rigid.
And any evidence of change is evidence of a history, and that is evidence for evolution.
Proof of evolution. Mm-hmm. If the alternate is pure static, a purely static world. So this becomes a very powerful, but you'll notice the lowering of the bar here. So are evolutionists on the hook to show how the elephant could have evolved, how wings could have evolved, how proteins could have evolved, how the blue, I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous. You don't have to show how all these incredible designs and mechanisms could have arisen by random mutation. Instead, all you have to do is find the tiniest change. And so you're off the hook. It's like if this is the spectrum of evolutionary change required, you're only dealing with a little 1 millimeter of change at one end. It's like, evolution is true. All the rest, it just happened somehow. In other words, the null hypothesis is a purely static world. You cannot overstate the importance of the fixity of species concept here. It is crucial in framing this problem. So they're utterly relying on a creationist, call it creationist concept from the 17th or 18th century that is used to prove evolution or to provide this powerful pillar of evidence. Any detectable change becomes proof of evolution. All those problems I talked about, the epigenetics and the Doug Irwin's papers and Behe's work, doesn't matter. All the limitations that the breeders were observing, the fact that the moths didn't show any, the finches, they don't show any change. They're just, they don't show any extrapolatable change. Doesn't matter. This relieves evolution of the burden of demonstrating how large-scale change can evolve. If the world is not completely static, then what? Evolution is true. Oh, that's nice. That's a very nice setup for your problem. So let's look at some, I'll just show you, finish up with some examples of evolutionists, and we'll go back to Ernst Mayr here. Evolutionary change is also simply a fact, owing to the changes in the content of gene pools from generation to generation. Yes, the allele, the frequencies of one allele to another may shift a little bit. Oh, evolution is true. Did you create a new protein? No. Did you create a metabolic pathway? No. Did you create anything new? No, nothing new is created except just some shifting of some frequencies. That evolution is true because the only other possibility is this two-dimensional cardboard view. It's 18th century view that, I mean, even Linnaeus discarded before his time. This is trivial compared to the large-scale change required by evolution. The gene pool shifting that he's talking about, gene pools from generation to generation shift. Oh, okay, that's trivial compared to the large-scale change that evolution requires, that you would think that an evolutionist would have to demonstrate. So just some more examples. Evolutionist Steve Jones writes that the changes observed in HIV, that virus, contain Darwin's what? Entire argument. So a virus mutates a little bit. I mean, literally a little bit. And that's Darwin's entire argument. I mean, in one sense, he's like showing how stupid the whole thing is. But his point is, even something like virus evolution proves evolution. Pam Bjorkman at Caltech says the same thing. A mutating virus is, quote, evolution at work. And, quote, in the same way people have evolved. No, it's not in the same way. That is a false statement. That's not good science. Again, we're seeing this theory-ladenness in our science here. It's this is if evolution is true, I have to say this. In the same way people have evolved, but over a much slower time. No, it doesn't work like that. But that's what they're saying. According to science writer Jonathan Weiner, he wrote about this, the Grants and the Finch's work on the Galapagos. According to Weiner, the changes in the beaks of birds show us Darwin's process in action. Same sort of idea. David Merrill, the creation of new species is in itself an insurmountable argument against a static species concept. So if I can just show this tiny bit of change, then I've defeated the static species concept. And the static species concept was a thing for Merrill. It was a thing. He wasn't just saying that as some sort of historical footnote. He was making an argument for evolution. Here's the book. These theories, in the words of the late Stephen Jay Gould, have been confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent. Evolution is one such theory. So they're arguing for evolution, and they're saying it would be perverse to deny the truth of evolution. Okay, skipping down. Most simply, evolution is any change in a population's genetic composition over time. Any change. Evolution has occurred when any genetic change, even something that seems insignificant, happens to any number of individuals in a population. I mean, they're just, everything they can say to just lower this bar down to the ground it's really kind of ridiculous, right? And I got a couple more examples. I'll skip over a couple more examples. but they're saying the same thing. So it's a dramatic lowering of the bar. So let's summarize this. What I said at the beginning was there's this 3-step process. When you look at these arguments for evolution, and if you don't understand this process, then I contend you're really not understanding evolutionary theory. Step number 1, there's the powerful claim, powerful evidential claim. Step number 2, it's scientific failure. It fails dramatically on the science, on the empirical science. It just gets destroyed. We saw that with the homology. We saw that with the nested hierarchy. Now we're seeing this with the small scale evidence. These are pillars. These are the main categories that evolutionists use to prove that evolution is a fact. They fail dramatically on the science, but there's an underlying power here. There's a persistence to the argument. Evolutionists don't miss a beat because that was not the argument. The argument was something else. It was, in this case, it's that, hey, there's change. Yeah, sure, the British moth story didn't turn out that great, and there's epigenetics, and there's this, that, and the other thing. You can't deny that there's change. Species, organisms do change. Gene pools do change. You do, create these differences. Epigenetics, this creates all kinds of changes. These lizards went through all kinds of changes. So therefore, creationism is false. Evolution is true. That's the argument. So what the point I'm making here is, if you don't understand the working of theology, the role of theology and the power of the theology, then you don't understand the theory of evolution. The theology is playing an epistemological role. It's not just a sidebar. It's crucial to the argument. It is incorporated. It is mandating the argument. So I say religion drives science, and it matters. So that's it for the 3rd category of evidence that we're talking about here.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we have a ton of really good comments, so I hope we can get through some of them. But I just want to kind of give maybe a little pushback on what I think people how they might react to this. And they might say, but, I've never even heard of the fixity of species. I've never even thought that way. I am not thinking about what God would do. I'm noticing these changes, and that's all I'm doing. And I'm saying these changes, show that evolution works.
Right. So that's that last part that you said there. That was going to be my question. My question to such a person is: do you still claim small scale change as a powerful pillar of evidence, as a kind of a confirming evidence for evolution, making evolution a no-brainer? And you finished up there, Rebecca, with that claim that I still see small scale change as this powerful evidence for evolution. Then you're showing that you either don't understand the science, or you are misrepresenting the science for some reason.
Okay, so because if you basically to think that little small changes like the color fluctuation in a moth means that an organ can arrange itself out of over millions of years, that's a totally different claim. And one is observed science and one is totally unobserved. So you're not being scientific there.
Right. And so that's why it's so crucial. We do need to look at the science. We do need to understand the scientific failures. So if an evolutionist is claiming this as evidence, then you're just kind of besmirching your good name. You're showing that you don't understand the science, or you're just simply misrepresenting it. You're sweeping it under the rug. There's something going on. You're doing confirmation testing. There's something going on. It would require a further dialogue and further engagement with such a person to figure out, what's the problem, because something's going wrong. I'm showing you a picture of a round Earth, and you're claiming that it's flat. So something's wrong there. There's something in your thinking. You've been influenced by something. And of course, we know what the problems usually are. We're living in a world that we're swimming in evolutionary thought and evolutionary doctrine. It's just fed to us on all sides. So it's very easy to go through an undergraduate degree get your degree, learn about this, and still be brainwashed about the science.
Totally. And I've noticed it, in the textbooks on biology and things. It's like evolution is on every page. So if you're seeing it that much, then just hearing the word over and over again, hearing the concept over and over again, yeah, it's having an influence on people. And, it people want to believe, well, the reason it's on every page is because it's so essential for biology.
Which
But
is the
really,
irony, which is
yeah,
the irony, because it is Epicureanism. It is completely contradictory to science. It is, of all the things I could think of, that's kind of like, wow, that's not really a good scientific theory. I mean, evolution is easily at the top of that list. It is so ridiculous. I'm not speaking here as a creationist or anything else. It's just science. The idea that the world arose by itself spontaneously is so ridiculous. And so, well, we're not talking about the world, we're talking about the biological world. Okay, that doesn't help any, okay? The idea that the entire biosphere arose by itself spontaneously is just so contraindicated by the scientific evidence. The preponderance of evidence just is against that idea. You have so much to overcome. It's like perpetual motion machine or flat Earth or geocentrism. You're holding to this theory that is just really, really bad. And you have to be capable of some independent thought. You can't just be consuming the misinformation, which is theologically driven, whether you know it or not. So that's why I try and tell the whole story, so you can kind of understand where the bad information is coming from. You literally are consuming theological, religious information. You are representing religion when you're making these arguments, even though you may not think you are.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of these comments, and I think I'm going to start at the most recent ones first. And first, just a little joke from B.S. Lewis: Darwin is my Jesus, raise him up. And I'm sure that's just a joke. B.S. Lewis loves Jesus somewhere deep in his heart. Okay, we have TP Seeker says, one of the most dramatic examples of evolution in real time is the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Strains such as MRSA and E. coli have quickly evolved to survive even our most powerful drugs.
Yeah, and so most of that comment is true, but that first part is where he goes off the rails. One of the most dramatic examples of evolution. So no, that's not evolution. First of all, most of these bacterial evolution stories do get you back into adaptive, directed adaptation of some sort or another. That's very, very common with bacteria, that there's some sort of directed adaptation. But even if it's just random mutation and natural selection acting, it doesn't create, it doesn't demonstrate how you would create the large scale change that evolution needs. You're still off at that end of the spectrum of change. And so what you've demonstrated is exactly what you say. The resistance to an antibiotic, that's what's demonstrated. And when you say it's demonstrating evolution, then you're not making a scientific statement. You're making a religious statement, whether you know it or not. That's not an empirical scientific statement. And so, you are demonstrating your bias, your non-scientific bias, when you make that sort of a statement.
Thank you. Rod says, now creationists are forced to say God would have done many things identical to evolution. Why? Why not?
Yeah, so they don't. A creationist would not be forced to say that, because when you look at biology, it doesn't look, it contradicts evolution over and over and over again. So all of the fundamental predictions of evolution have failed. So if you're a creationist, you certainly wouldn't have to say what you're saying here, that, well, it looks like evolution. No, it doesn't look like evolution. Evolution has failed over and over again. In fact, I don't think you could imagine a theory, a scientific theory, that has survived so many falsifications. There's a lot of bad theories in the history of science, but they usually fall away. The bloodletting, they go away. Evolution hasn't gone away. Well, because there's more to it. It's religiously driven, and religion is more powerful than science.
Rod says fixity of species was a reasonable assumption based on belief in a creator God.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. It depends on your theology, right? So it is certainly reasonable to the people who believe that. So you could say that, but any sort of a robust theology, I think, would also certainly be okay with species adapting to the environment. So I would say a purely static world is a two-dimensional cardboard theology, but also to be charitable to people centuries ago with less information at hand. That may have been a reasonable idea. I want to be charitable to people. But when you say it's a reasonable belief, so evolution, if you are an evolutionist or certainly an atheist, you will be tempted to use that claim as that was a reasonable doctrine, and it turned out to be false. So therefore, by modus tollens, we know that evolution is true. So this is a restatement of the argument. So in order for that argument to work that Rod is making there, he must believe that the creator God would create species that are fixed. So you have to believe that in order for this argument to work, if God, I'll spell it out. If God created the world, the species would be fixed. The species are not fixed, therefore God did not create the world. That's the argument. Well, that first part there, the inference, you must believe that. You must believe that that's true. If you are wishy-washy on that, you say, well, God could have created a world with fixity of species, but maybe he didn't. Then your argument dissolves. You lose the entire argument. If he could have created a world where the species weren't fixed, then my evidence doesn't do me any good. It doesn't do me any good. It doesn't falsify creationism. So the entire argument that you're making here, Rod, and that the evolutionists make, assumes, it entails the theological claim that God would create a world where the species are fixed. That is a religious claim. You could argue that it's reasonable. You could even argue that it's where it came from and so forth, all this stuff. But it is a theological claim. It's not a scientific claim. So your theory is entailing theology. If we just stick to the science, if we just look at the empirical science, evolutionists do not have a cause. There's no plausible cause for how the species arose. That's a pretty big problem with your theory, amongst many other problems. Like I said, all of the fundamental predictions turn out to be false. Evolutionists have been arguing vigorously amongst themselves ever since Darwin, trying to fix these problems. And even today, evolutionists are trying to come up with a new theory to replace the modern synthesis because it failed. So you have arguing, new theories trying to be developed, no plausible cause, failed predictions, all of the fundamental predictions failed. The theory is contradicted by the science. But you can fall back on statements like this, and that helps you. That is a powerful argument for you, but it is dependent upon theological premises. That's why this is all about theology.
Now, B.S. Lewis asks, how do we escape religious bias as a species?
Well, now we're getting into a deep philosophical, theological discussion. I don't think it's that hard. I mean, I can look at scientific evidence. I've got my science training. Got my degrees. I love to look at data, and I understand, the different ways to look at data. And if I'm going to make a claim that's got a premise built into it, that's going to be a weakness. That's not necessarily a bad thing you can make. You can have premises. By the way, I should say that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having religious premises. You can, people have religious premises, but we need to recognize them where we can't lie about them and mischaracterize a theory as science when it's contingent upon theology.
Reezy is back, says, I really enjoyed you guys' videos on ERVs. Very insightful.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
And somebody says, thanks, Rebecca and Dr. Hunter. Great video watching from Brazil. God bless.
Right.
Thank
Brazil.
you. There's a lot of creationists in Brazil now, so it's kind of interesting. Now, Exo says small scale evolution. So evolution. So, and Exo is not a believer in evolution. I think he's reacting to, us talking about evolution, like, presenting small scale evolution.
Yeah, it's hard to respond to such a terse comment.
Oh, does that feel terse to you? I guess I'm like immune to terse comments. I don't like pay attention. I just, it doesn't.
Well, the person a little bit better maybe, so you're able to read it again, but I need to have a little bit to work with.
Okay. TP Seeker says change is evolution.
There we go. Change. That's a great one. I love that one. That's even farther than what we've been looking at in this video. Here we've been looking at small scale change in species, but when evolutionists really need a strong argument, yeah, they got that one. Change is evolution. Any change. So your world is completely static, or else evolution is true. I mean, when the wind blows, evolution is true. The sun rose, the evolution is true.
Okay, so there's been a few more comments come in. I'll let Exo, because he followed up with this. Change doesn't help adaptation, let alone evolution. Nothing is an exact copy of its parents. This is called normal creation.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
Okay, thank you.
I just think evolutionists should reckon with the severe, dramatic scientific problems with their theory. It just is just from a strictly empirical scientific perspective, theory neutral, drop, the theories, just look at the evidence and then consider evolutionary theory. It's just contradicted over and over and over again. And so instead of jumping to these, theological, metaphysically laden arguments, this, that, you can't just ignore these monumental problems with your theory.
Now you're going to love this. Rod says, then you'll have to agree that after God created all the wonderful species, he just let them go extinct at random.
Right. So extinction is another problem. By the way, Lamarck avoided that problem by saying that they just evolved into something else. They didn't go extinct. So Lamarck was, that was a thing for Lamarck, that, extinction is a problem. It's another problem with this greater God theology. So here Rod is saying, hey, okay, you're going to have to admit this, and that's, evolutionists are great at driving trucks through these theological conundrums, and driving home, do you believe God did that? Do you believe God? How did he could he create a rock that he couldn't lift? What about salvation? Who does he choose to save? All these, wow, these are really hard questions. I don't know the answer to this, but I do know that evolution, is contradicted by empirical science, and you are making a religious argument for your theory. You are attacking creationism, which, but just be aware that's what you're doing. You are a religious zealot. You're not making a scientific argument.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me because this is one of the things I noticed when I was reading your book, Dr. Hunter, is how the religious concerns do change over time. And so, and I will give this one as an example for me. When I read this, like, this has no religious power for me. Like, this has no theological weight for me. Like, it never occurred to me that God shouldn't let species go extinct. But this might have been really powerful for people in the past, and it might be powerful for some people today. It depends on how you're thinking about God. For me, This doesn't hit me as an argument.
Yeah, yeah, right. And I can definitely, by the way, just to sympathize with Rod here, I definitely can see the argument and see the weight of the argument. In fact, when I teach my origins class, I want the students to feel the weight. If you do not feel the weight of an argument like this one, or the dozens of other ones that evolutionists make, then you're not understanding evolution, because that's what evolution is all about. And the idea that species would go extinct, I'll just give voice to Rod here. God created all these species, and then like one of them went extinct. I mean, like could it not survive? Like that sucks. He created this design that failed, or the environment shifted, so it killed it off. Like a comet hit the Earth. I mean, what is this, like things just randomly happening, just screwing up our world? Like there's comet hit, and this is huge dust cloud, and this climatological disaster, and like 90% of the species died. Like, was that in the plan? Like, why would you do this? This like makes no sense. And so I can definitely see, the greater God. God did not do things the way I would do it. Therefore, it doesn't make sense. And therefore I don't like it. And therefore I got to have evolution, to hang my hat on here, because this isn't working for me. To admit that God would have done this, even to the extent of a totally absurd theory that evolution is just utterly ridiculous on the empirical science. The world arose by itself. The entire biological world, the tens of millions of species, all these incredible designs. Yeah, that just arose by itself. It must have. That's how powerful the evolution is. The religion is. That's why I say, the theology is stronger than the science. It's more powerful. It will make people look foolish. It'll make them believe in ridiculous, absurd things.
Now, do you think all the people who are believing in evolution it's because of these theological concerns? Or do you think many people have just been convinced, like, hey, it's a scientific theory, this is science, and they aren't engaging in the theology?
I think the latter. I think they're all over the map, and we're hundreds of years, 150 years past Darwin, several hundred years past, Christian Wolff and Leibniz and Thomas Burnet and all these, and then thousands of years past the Epicureans. So I think the biggest contribution that Darwin made was he made it sound scientific. He made Epicureanism sound scientific, whereas for the centuries and centuries before Darwin, it was acknowledged that we're making theological arguments. Okay, that's not in doubt, and that's not in question here. We're making theological arguments. Let's make them, and let's try and win the argument. Darwin changed that. He put a scientific patina on these religious arguments. The theology is still there. It runs all through Origins, but you have to be a historian or a philosopher to get it, because he's very clever in his rhetoric. And so now, 150 years past Darwin's Origin of Species, yes, a lot of people are subsumed into that brainwashing, into that deception. That I read Origin of Species. It's just science. Like, wow, you really didn't see it. Like you really got fooled. And then you've got all, Stephen Jay Gould and, all the, Jerry Cohn and all the Dawkins and all the evolutionists in more recent decades doing the same thing that Darwin did. They're still making the religious arguments, but they are cleverly written so that it doesn't show through. So it's got a scientific patina. And when they do occasionally make an overtly religious argument, it's always cast as, I'm just talking to the creationists. I'm just using their ideas here. So there's so many moving parts here. The shell game is going on to confuse you. So I definitely, Rebecca, think that there's a spectrum of thought out there in the evolutionary camp. I would say most evolutionists are completely oblivious to the role of theology. And even though they may be employing those ideas when they make their arguments and are in discussions, they have no idea. It's just the deception is very, very strong.
Okay, Bill says another hypothesis, an alien race put it all here on Earth, then left, not gods, just other species. Why isn't that the default if evolution is wrong? Now, I like this because, we were talking about how there are people who set it up as there's only two options, creation and evolution, and you really can't get anything else there. It's got to be one or the other. And so here is somebody saying, well, maybe there's another option. So what do you think about this option?
So it is true that Francis Crick did seriously posit panspermia and the idea that, you had alien race seeding things. So I wouldn't say that has not been set forth, but you just have to understand the history to this. Ideas have a history, and there's a history of thought here. And the history of thought is strongly influenced by theological and metaphysical, concepts and beliefs that go back, of course, Christian, but also the ancient Greeks and so forth. So there's just those people typically did not indulge in the ET hypothesis. Extraterrestrials came and planted that. That's just not a typical idea in the history of thought. This is not to say that they didn't think about ETs. They certainly did think about ET. There's a long history of hypothesizing about extraterrestrials and the plurality of worlds, but not that they came and seeded life here. I think that was, Crick brought that up 50 years ago, but it's not really a strong, alternative.
And it actually doesn't, if you keep following it, it doesn't really provide an alternative because it just pushes it back one step. So then so then where did the aliens come from? Did they develop by natural processes or were they created? So you're eventually going to have to come down to the two options, like created or come about by chemical processes, always be there, whatever, So I don't know.
I think the fact that Crick brought it up does demonstrate that if you think long and hard enough about it and you reckon with the real problems of evolution, that eventually it can come up for someone smart like Crick was, that it can come up and you can set forth that idea as a solution. But you got to realize the strength of the argument, the strength of evolution and Epicureanism it's seriously driven by theological concerns. Like they're not just throwing these things out there like throwing a dog a bone. They're really concerned about this idea that they want to make sure we understand God would not have done this, and so somehow it happened on its own. They probably would be okay, as Crick was, that okay if you had plausible evidence for a extraterrestrial coming and planting biological seeds, planting organisms. It's okay, that's acceptable to me. We got God off the table. We got God distant. He's meditating on a distant Mount Olympus. He's not doing stuff in this world. That's my main concern. And Darwin said that. I don't really care if Lamarck was right, or if I'm right, or if these other guys are right. The main thing, we got God off the table. Because I'm an atheist, I'm a materialist? No, because I'm concerned about the idea that God would have created this world, because that violates my utilitarianism and my plenitude and my problem of evil and all these other concerns about God. These are deeply held concerns about God, about what he would and wouldn't do. Whether I'm an atheist or not, they still appeal to these same arguments.
Yes. So Not Evolution says no evidence for evolution, making creation true by default. What do you think about this idea?
Oh, I mean, it's true. I mean, I think of evolution as I'll use the word deism as a stand-in. I don't have a good word for this theological movement that's driving evolution, so I'm just going to use the closest thing, or at least one candidate is deism. I don't think that fully explains it, but evolution was deism's best shot. they had to have this be true. And they were arguing for a naturalistic origins for centuries. I mean, this goes back, long ago. And then they finally got it with Darwin's theory of evolution. That was their best shot. So, okay, we got our creation story. The world arose by these different mechanisms, the Big Bang and all the astronomical things, the evolution of the solar system. And now we got the evolution of life. So we got our thing in place. It fails dramatically. So therefore, by modus tollens, it's got to be something else. And the most plausible, the ones that kind of comes to mind, are some sort of creationism or design or something. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a valid point that if evolution isn't working, you ought to think about something else. When you look at, again, you just go to a biology class, get a life science degree or any kind of science degree. Once you drop the deception, so that's what I think this allows. If you understand the failure of evolution, at least it allows you to drop the deception, at least to start to have an open mind. Okay, let me just look at the evidence, and then all of a sudden, oh wow, it is so overwhelming. You cannot get through a single biology lecture, without it just like, oh my, the incredible biological world. It's true for geology as well and other things, but it really comes through in the life sciences.
Yeah, and I want to address this one. So R. Brown says, okay, you've convinced me. Evolution is false. Life on Earth was created by the god Brahman and is being actively maintained by Vishnu. Here's what I want to say to you. Good. If you went from believing that nothing became and created life, and life came about by itself, and now instead you believe there is a god or gods involved, bravo, because that's a much better view. It's going from the bottom of the barrel of views to a much better view. Of course, I don't want you to stay with Brahman and Vishnu. I want you to seek out and find out who is the God that created. And I think you might come to a different answer, but this is still really a step up from believing in no God, right?
Yeah, no, good point, Rebecca. It's the main thing is, I know this comment is in jest and it's rhetorical, but if someone were to actually understand, if someone were an evolutionist and they looked at the evidence from a theory neutral perspective and looked at the failures and realized, oh, this is actually failing, that is a monumental step. I appreciate anyone who is able to do that, because this is not true. It's not just like, oh, theory A is better than theory B. Like the way that nerve cells work. I'm looking at this different theory of how nerve cells work. There's nothing at stake. I will agree with this other theory about the way that nerve cells work. Okay, fine. No big deal. This is different, right? This is huge. And that gets to the fact that it's metaphysically laden. It's theologically laden. And you cannot make that jump easily. So to me, that's the big thing. Whether you're going to go to whatever other theory is, that's beyond my view here. I'm just hoping that people can be good scientists and can be honest and not deceived in looking at the science and not promoting or believing in a deception.
Yes. TP Seeker says ingredients for life discovered on 2 different asteroids. There are 20 amino acids that create the proteins required for life on our planet, 14 found on an asteroid millions of miles away. Binu.
I think there's even more interesting evidences than that. So it is definitely interesting about what we find out there. But when you talk about 14 different amino acids, that's a long, long ways from life, right? You have to have something a lot more than that. So, but I do think there are actually other things that are closer to life. I wouldn't be surprised if they did find something kind of like a bacteria or something, or telltale signs of bacterial life or something on other planets or moons. But I mean, I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah. And, you can't just have amino acids floating around, right? You have to have them organized, and you need them to be in, a non-mixture. You have to have left-handed amino acids for life. And I'm certain that the amino acids that they found are not all left-handed amino acids. They would naturally be a mixture of left and right-handed amino acids. So this is, I mean, and even if you had amino acids lined up, all the right kind in the right order to make a single protein, you still don't have anything close to getting life. Guys, it's just absolutely nuts. It's bonkers to think that finding amino acids is anything significant toward getting to life. So
Yeah,
just
well said.
thank
It
you.
is so far. Yeah, you are literally at the very beginning here, and there's huge gaps. When they tried to develop origin of life theories, and in 1924, one of the leading researchers said, we're pretty close to a solution to the origin of life. 1924, not 2024. So that was more than 100 years ago. Maybe it was 1926. Might have been 100 years ago this year. I can't remember. But anyway, it didn't happen, and they finally started admitting a few years ago, we might not be able to ever solve this problem. And so, yeah, it's a very difficult problem. And when they tried to go the other direction and say, well, let's take a living or the simplest bacteria that we know of and kind of simplify it, take away genes, take things away and see if it still works. And, if it was necessary, okay, put it back in. But how far can we go? Can we get this thing down to like just a few genes? And no, they had to stop at around 450 genes. And
Yeah.
that was, yeah. So
450 genes, guys. And that is like stretches of thousands of DNA code for each gene, thousands of bits of code. And,
and it wasn't doing anything at that point. I mean, it was just sitting there. It was, to call it alive, was kind of a push,
Yes. And I like what Bandit says about this. Ingredients for a cake are in every grocery store, but that doesn't mean they will mindlessly swirl themselves together in a cake. I mean, these people are nuts. It is so true. This is a great analogy because, no one would ever think that, a cake box in a store is going to suddenly spontaneously become a cake. Do you realize that getting to life is much, much harder than getting raw cake ingredients to come together to make a cake? So, that it's a great analogy. Thank you, Bandit.
And it's actually inspired by evolutionary theory, this idea of like, well, if I could just get the amino acids together and get some nucleotides together, then because evolution has this view, it imposes this view of life as a simplistic, just crock pot of just, luckily things got, put together and all of a sudden started working. And that is a theory-laden view of life, which is over and over again proven wrong. Another argument for that, Rebecca, is, okay, give me a population of bacteria, put it into a pot and boil it, and put it through some, maybe put in some acids or whatever, something that really kill this off and disassemble it. So you've just got, now I've got the raw ingredients for a population of bacteria, which is pretty good. I mean, you've got amino acids, you've got nucleotides, you've got fats, you've got all these things in there, hydrocarbons and carbohydrates. Do you think, now if I set this aside for a little while and put it under some, have some lightning and have some conditions, do you think that's going to produce life? I think most people
definitely
can't.
not.
Especially if I dumped it into a lake or a pond.
Yeah.
Not going to happen.
Definitely not. Okay, so Mike says, hi, Rebecca and Cornelius just managed to tune in, doing a great job. Thank you, Mike. Jamie says hi. Doki says hi. Thank you. And let's see. Okay, we already did this one. Bill says, species is a human categorization of what we see.
Yep. True.
Yep. And TP says, so when and where was our human species created? I'm kind of interested to hear your answer on this, Dr. Hunter.
My answer is, oh man, I don't know. Evolution must be true. So it just gets back to, they will always shift. They always want that spotlight to get off of evolution and get it onto creationism. There's always shifting that thing back. Tell me this then, tell me that. And if you don't know, then evolution is true. What do you believe? What do you believe?
And this is what I've noticed, Dr. Hunter. I've done probably like 20 to, I think more closer to 30 episodes where I just let evolutionists come on and share their evidence for evolution. But you'll see that in all of that time, only a few people have actually shared evidence for evolution. Instead, they mostly want to pick on young Earth creation, which I'm a young Earth creationist, but I admit it's much harder to defend, right? I mean, there's so many topics related to this, geology, cosmology, so many things related. And it also is, there's evidence against young Earth as well as evidence for young Earth. So it's much easier to pick on young Earth. And that's mostly what people do, which just to me, shows what I already know, which is the evidence for evolution is so bad, so terribly bad that this is what they have to resort to.
Well, that's true. I think you're absolutely right about that. But I would add that historically it has always, and even now, the apologetics, it's always been driven by theological concerns. Darwin's book was full of that. That's what motivated Darwin. He went out there on his 5-year trip and it just wasn't making sense. He found these eggs that ostriches had laid on the plains in South America. And they had these ostrich eggs lying around and they weren't being protected. And he wrote about this. He said, I was able to collect a bunch of these eggs myself, these huge eggs. And his point was, this is not a good adaptation. This wouldn't have been done this way. In typical manner, he wrote about it in kind of a clever way, but his argument was, God would have done it this way. Whereas in Job 39:17, what does God say to Job? He says, look at the ostrich. It doesn't guard her egg. She doesn't guard her eggs. She leaves them unprotected. And
I didn't give her the good sense.
Right.
I didn't give her the good sense. That's what God says.
Her the good sense. So if Darwin had read Job 39:17, he might have thought twice about that passage. But I'm joking. The point is, he's utilitarian. He's a theological utilitarian. Even if he had read 39:17, he wouldn't have believed it. It's like, no, God wouldn't do that. Theological utilitarians believe that God would create the best, most optimal adapted species. So they're not going to do things like leaving eggs unattended. But that's exactly what God says in Job 39:17. So that's a hilarious example of where you do clearly have a theological argument and that it's non-biblical.
Yeah. And I do, before I put this comment down, I will answer this from my perspective about when our species was created. This does not reflect Dr. Hunter's view. He has other views on that, but I do believe that the biblical genealogies are correct. And that means we have Adam to Jesus Christ and all the generations. Now, I do admit there could be skipped generations, but but you can only skip so many and maintain a genealogy. So that would put humanity at probably less than 10,000 years old. So I believe God created us within the last 10,000 years. And for some people that might be like, what? That's crazy. We have artifacts, we have archaeology. But if you start looking into it, you'll actually find that there is good evidence that we have been on Earth for less than that. I mean, if you've tracked the population, if you track population growth, you'll see it fits very nicely with this view, and it doesn't at all fit the evolutionary timeline of human history. If you try to look into how does population growth work, back in according to the evolution story, for so long they have like the population growth at 0.0000, like bunch of zeros and a one, and it's like, wow, can a population really be that low for so long and survive? It just doesn't really make sense with our scientific observations. I could keep going on this for a long time, but I won't leave it. I mean, I'll leave it because that's not the topic of what we're doing, but I just wanted to give my answer about when we were created.
I have a thought that is a little bit tangential, but it has to do with human evolution. Everything I talk about the religious influence on science, and especially the religious influence on evolution, and how religion has played this role in evolutionary theory. And so the question comes up, is it biblical? Is it good theology? What have you? And so I think it's important to distinguish. There's two categories of these religious premises. One is the religion that has mandated the theology that has mandated evolution. The other is, okay, do you believe that evolution could be used by God? Is it theologically okay? Is it biblically okay? Forget about the mandating part and how it has played this crucial role in evolutionary theory, but just if we found out that evolution occurred, or if you found some good, strong evidence for evolution, would you be amenable to it, or would you reject it on theological grounds?
Are you asking me?
No, I'm laying this out. I'm going to give my answer. Mm-hmm. So, but I just think it's important that people don't often separate this cleanly. So in other words, you've got all these Christians and Muslims and Jews and people who are evolutionists, and they obviously hold that it's okay. God used evolution as his creation tool. So theologically, biblically, it's okay. Evolution is okay. There's nothing in scripture that would say you can't have evolution. This other category is, no, you must have evolution because God wouldn't do it that way. So those arguments I see as non-biblical, and I think there's problems with them. I trace the histories of those, and I talk about those and make videos and books and stuff on those. But this other category, I have always said, or at least kind of softly maintained, that I'm okay with that. I don't have a problem with God using evolution as his creation tool. In fact, I think there's certain verses in Genesis that even look like evolution. Let the earth bring forth. Kind of sounds like, that's like God isn't really doing that directly. It sounds like it's secondary causes. So I'm okay with God using secondary causes to a large extent to create the world. It doesn't really bother me. What bothers me is the science. I mean, it's a ridiculous, absurd, and what bothers me is the non-biblical theology used to create. Okay, so that's going to be kind of my view. Is it's theologically okay, but not the fact of evolution. The truth of evolution is mandated by non-biblical theology. Now,
yes, and I want to explain for people watching, because a lot of people have heard you say that you're not a creationist, and they're like, but he's always talking about the Bible. Of course he's a creationist. But the reason Dr. Hunter is saying he's not a creationist is because he's saying the creationists have the same type of theological concerns that the evolutionists have. They're making the same type of argument. And so that's like the issue with that, right? So like you're trying to avoid falling into,
There's two reasons. One is what you just said, that I do see the parallel, the overlap between creationism and evolution. I think at bottom, they're very similar, almost the same thing. But there's something else about creationism, which is it's biblically mandated. Evolution is not okay. You cannot have evolution with the Bible. Just from a theological, hermeneutical perspective, I don't care what the evidence is for evolution, it must be false. And that's where I'm not coming from that. I'm okay. I'm like Joshua Swamidas and Francis Collins and all those guys, all those evolutionists who say it's biblically okay. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm with you on that. I'm on board with that. It's biblically okay. I don't have a problem with evolution being true from a theological perspective. I have a problem with it must be true because of these non-biblical religious positions, and science is absurd. It's ridiculous from a scientific perspective. But I'm not theologically. I've never been theologically driven to I've got to reject evolution because Genesis and this and that. That's just never. That's never been my perspective. The reason I'm bringing this up is I'm kind of starting to change a little bit on that second one. I'm starting to have a problem theologically with evolution. So I've always said it's okay, but now I'm thinking, no, I don't think it's okay. There's a problem, and that is the human soul. So the typical view, and as expressed by the Roman Catholic Church in Humani Generis, it's a 1950 encyclical, is that you have evolution working all the way up and until Adam. And at that point, God instantaneously or immediately implants or injects the human soul. Okay. Now that may sound okay. It's like, well, okay. If you're an evolutionist, it's like, okay, yeah, what's the problem? That's our view. Evolution created the fish and the amphibians and the reptiles and the mammals and the birds, and you got up to the primates, and then God said, okay, this is now the time. I'm going to inject or implant the human soul. And the Roman Catholics have this doctrine of hylomorphism to describe the soul, that the soul is not this other thing. It's not detached, it really is integrated with the body, and it is a form of the body, which is a Platonic idea. And the Roman Catholic Church has its Greek influences, but it's not a bad doctrine, even though I'm not a Roman Catholic. But I think, I agree with a lot of things. I don't throw it out. I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think they have a lot of good doctrines. And that one, I think, is, as far as I can see, I'm not an expert at this, but it seems like a reasonable doctrine of hylomorphism. But the problem arises when you have, I don't think you can have evolution and hylomorphism in the same theory. I don't think it works. And I think that Roman Catholics have made a huge mistake. And I think this is way worse than the Galileo affair, which they are at pains to avoid. And I think that actually influenced them to go with Humani Generis and to greenlight evolution, because they didn't want to do another Galileo affair, which I actually don't think they did such a bad thing. I actually think they were kind of reasonable in the Galileo affair. They get a bad rap for that. Not that I agree with everything they did, but they're responding to that. And now they have, we're going to greenlight evolution. You just shot yourself in the foot. And that makes me realize I think evolution is theologically unacceptable, because if you have evolution working on up to Adam, and then you implant this human soul, I think you've really got a problem there, because you just signed up to having evolution create what? Thought, consciousness, conscious sensory perception, the will, whatever that means. All that stuff is there. Yeah, you don't have the soul yet. And so that's a lot. There's a lot you don't have yet, like ethics and stuff. But animals have souls. The pre-Adam, just before Adam got that implantation of the consciousness of the human soul, he had to have all the mechanics up and running. That's not scientifically indicated. There's no. I mean, that's a huge problem for evolution. How could evolution have created that? And yet that's what the Humani Generis is saying, that you can have evolution all the way up to the human soul. I think you've given it away at that point. You've given it away. They've given the store away, because once you have evolution doing all that stuff, that ethics stuff and that extra stuff that came along with human soul, I mean, that's a small thing for evolution to do. And so it wasn't only a few years later until Hamilton came out with his evolutionary ethics theory, and all that just took the world by storm. And now all the evolutionists believe all ethics is all evolved.
I have a lot to say about this topic, but I feel like I want to try to get through the comments that are related to this topic, because we could have a whole conversation on that.
Sorry about that, but I just wanted to, that's been something on my mind.
Totally.
My thinking is kind of changing on that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so Ryan says, hello, Rebecca. Mainstream cosmology is the foundation for evolutionary biology. Genesis 1 and 2 contradict both. So why do Christians accept mainstream cosmology while rejecting evolutionary biology? Thank you, Ryan, for this. This could also be a very big conversation. I just want to say that I think we should reject mainstream cosmology on a scientific basis. We don't even have to talk about the Bible. We can talk about all the invented entities to make the current model work. And it's like ridiculous scientifically. The Big Bang and all of this is based on very little evidence. I mean, we can say there is the evidence of the redshift, and that is, the redshift is real, right? But what causes the redshift, that is an open question. And now for years, people have dogmatically said that the redshift is caused by expansion. And that is, they're basing that on the evidence of the CMB, the cosmic microwave background, and which that prediction of the CMB was off by, an order of magnitude when it was made. And so when we found it, it was off by an order of magnitude of what was predicted. Plus, the CMB could be many things. It doesn't have to be the remnants of the Big Bang. So to me, modern cosmology is just as bad as evolution. So I think we don't even have to talk about the Bible stuff. We can just say, look, let's reject it on a scientific basis, for the same reason that we reject evolution. On a purely scientific basis, we can reject it. We can talk about the theology separately.
I'll just add 3 points, and I agree with what Rebecca, you're saying. Scientifically, there are huge problems with modern standard cosmology. Just look at the evolution of the moon, Earth system, or the evolution of the solar system. It's run into problem after problem after problem. There is no good theory of that, although they, the thing about evolutionists is they will always say that we have a theory and that's a fact. So scientifically, it's a big problem. Secondly, yes. I do think that you make a good point that it's that it's related to modern evolutionary theory, but you overstate it. It's not foundational. I would not say modern cosmology is foundational to modern evolutionary theory. Yes, there is a relationship, and it did come before, kind of started in the 18th century. In the 19th century, you got evolution, biological evolution. But I think you go too far when you say it's foundational. But thirdly, I will say that theological foundations of biology, theological, critical mandates in biology are also there in cosmology. And if you look at Bernoulli and Buffon and Kant and Laplace and their early cosmology theories, it's all based on plenitude. And so that plenitude is such a powerful plenitude, coupled with the principle of sufficient reason. So principle of plenitude, principle of sufficient reason coupled together is crucial in cosmological evolution as it is. And it now provides the most powerful evidence argument for biological evolution. It's all religion. It's all religious.
We're going to keep just riffing off each other, because now you brought up the solar system formation problems, and I can't resist. I have to say, listen, whoever is watching this and you think young Earth creation is ridiculous, I want you to check your own backyard. If you accept the standard model of solar system formation, you have just swallowed an absolutely absurd idea that contradicts all kinds of things that we know about physics. So please check your own backyard. Even star formation, it has physics problems. So like, just, don't throw out other theories based on ridiculous ideas if you're not willing to examine your own current beliefs.
Yeah. Yes. Amen.
Okay. So Laura says, Rebecca, I translated into Portuguese some posts from Dr. Hunter's blog some years ago. Happy to see all this high quality content in your channel. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I can't say anything in Portuguese, so I can't really respond. I do know a little Spanish, but no Portuguese.
So Rod says, I was thinking of a similar example to show that C's argument doesn't work. Epigenetics doesn't predict the future. I'm not sure.
It doesn't. It does. I agree. It doesn't predict the future. You're misunderstanding the argument, the problem. Epigenetics does not predict the future, but it does provide adaptations that work in the future. So future threats, future environmental shifts, that some of them do occur, and then the epigenetics works for that. Those could not have been known and could not have been selected for prior to their event. So you can't evolve. It's a problem for the evolution of epigenetics. First of all, the complexity of epigenetics dwarfs the capability of evolutionary, random mutation, natural selection. But if we're you could just stop the discussion right there. I mean, it's just kind of silly. We're deeply into a emperor's new clothes kind of story here. It's just like, what? Like, you actually believe that epigenetics evolved by random mutation and natural selection? Like, do you really understand the mechanisms? This is just kind of ridiculous. But if somehow it could have evolved, got lucky, astronomically lucky, it wouldn't be selected for. It's not. We're not saying it predicts the future, but it is protecting you against a environmental threat that does not exist. It only exists in the future. It may not exist ever.
I'm glad you understood that comment. Thank you. And I think this will be our final comment. There are still some good comments, but we've been going for over 2 hours. So Not Evolution says, the problem with those who are unable to see evolution, I think, is that they don't have imaginations. Gail Kennedy, Ph.D., Anthropology, UCLA.
So that sounds like an evolutionist, a pro-evolution comment, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I've said, yeah, you just don't you just don't. You're being too picky. You're not like letting your imagination,
Well, wait, hold on. Sorry. It's the person who wrote the quote is from a pro-evolution person, but the person who's writing it is saying,
"Oh, I see. Okay,
this is how ridiculous." They're saying this.
Okay.
All we
so I'm
need
responding.
for
So I'm
evolution
responding.
is better imaginations.
So I'm responding to Gail Kennedy, not to the not evolution.
Right. Exactly.
I got it. Very good. That's a good quote. And yeah, so I'm responding to Gail to say the problem with evolutionists is they're not they're deceived, and they're not reckoning with science. So it's like, if you believe the earth is flat, and I'm like, no, there's all kinds of problems with it. You're just not, you're just not using your imagination enough. Like, come on, let's go by the science here.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so just wrapping up, look, small scale evolution, we observe small changes in organisms, but we cannot extrapolate that and say that means we can get new organs, limbs, and all these things. And the core reasoning there is a religious reasoning, a theology that God wouldn't have, there would be this fixity of species and no change would happen. So am I summing that up, or do you want to add more to that, Dr. Hunter?
Yeah, that's a good way. I could add, only maybe I'll try for a simpler one. It's just religion drives science. Once you see that, once you understand it, you'll start to get it, that, the world is not driven by this nice, clean, objective men in white lab coats just coming to objective conclusions, measuring the data with no thought about the cultural, social, religious impacts. It's just that it's not the way it worked. And the way it worked was Darwin and a lot of earlier thinkers were driven by religious concerns. And it's very, very powerful. These are very powerful arguments and concerns, just like we see in the comments here today. They'll always come at you with these religious concerns, whether they're legit, whether they're honest, genuinely held by the questioner, or whether they're just making a rhetorical argument. Nonetheless, these are the powerful arguments for evolution. They're theological. Once you actually look at the science genuinely, honestly, without some sort of, a filter, there's no excuse. It literally no excuse. You can't possibly look at this stuff and argue, yeah, it arose by itself spontaneously. It's just so silly. So you're not in a good place. You're in a very undefendable place. You have there's no excuse for your position. Yeah, so that's my kind of encouragement to people.
Yes, and I would like to say, just as the final thought on that, if you feel like you're in a secure place, you might be relying on the authority, the passed down, the consensus science. You're depending on other people who, you would say, how could so many people be wrong? And
Right.
It's just a fact that humans have been wrong about a lot of things throughout history, and they are most certainly wrong about evolution. So please do not just rest and trust in what you've been taught in your textbooks, because you have to examine and critically think about this. And I think if you do that and you're willing to, you will discover that you have come to believe something that is completely false.
Yeah, and it goes way beyond science. It involves false religion and deception. Jesus talked about deceptions to come, and he talked about how powerful they would be. Now, I don't know exactly what deceptions he was talking about, but this is a very powerful deception, very, very powerful. And if you're in the grips of that, do something about it. Think about it, read about it, consider how you got into the place where you're at. Because I know I've been in deception. I've walked in darkness and in deception, and it's really hard. It's really, really hard to get out of it and to see the light and once you get it, it's like, oh, wow, man, I can't believe how stupid I was. But, it's deception is a very powerful thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter. And for the viewers today, appreciated all your comments. Have a great day.
Likewise.